Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rumi Forum, for inviting me. What I'd like to talk about today is the headscarf debate, not only in Turkey, but also the way it is taking place in Western Europe, essentially, in the European Union. There are interesting parallels between what is taking place in Turkey and the debate in Europe, although there are important differences as well. So, the first part of my talk, I'll try to focus on the situation in Europe. And the second part, I'll try to stick to the debate in Turkey. And then we can draw conclusions about differences and parallels. The question of Muslims in Europe since 9/11 has become a very contentious issue, partly because of the fact that some of the hijackers were themselves perceived to be radicalized in Europe. The Hamburg cell, we know Mohammed Atta was part of it. Zakaria Moussaoui was a French Muslim. And after 9/11, we had terrorist incidents in London and Madrid, which basically is a very alarming situation for the US policymakers, for US media, to the degree that there is now a sense of exaggeration in the United States about the presence of Muslims in Europe and a tendency to see Europe as a kind of jihad factory, the second generation of Muslims, essentially the third generation and second generation, which have huge integration problems, are turning more and more towards Islam. That is the perception in the United States. And the next attack, the next 9/11, will come from Muslims in Europe, who some of them have citizenship, therefore are not subject to the same visa regulations for the United States. That's almost a caricature that you can easily see on news channels like Fox Media, which basically focuses on the most radical elements in Europe. And the headscarf debate in this very polarized context of Europe has caught the attention of Americans. So the first thing to say, I guess, is that we should avoid sweeping generalizations about the headscarf situation in Europe. There are countries like France where the concept of secularism defines the way they approach the question of the headscarf. So one element that we should keep in mind is we have to look at what kind of secularism is practiced in Europe. And the answer is multiple. There is not one type of secularism. And that's very relevant for Turkey as well, because Turkey's understanding of secularism is also a quite peculiar understanding of secularism. It would not be breaking news to you when I say the Turkish way of secularism is very similar to the French way of secularism. And in fact, the French have a different word for secularism. Secularism is essentially an Anglo-Saxon term, and it is rooted in the Anglo-Saxon history of a less confrontational relationship between church and state. For instance, in Britain, you have an Anglican church, you have a state church, whereas in France, the idea of a state church was anathema. That's partly why the French Revolution happened, to basically break the links between the monarchy, the Ancien Régime, and the Catholic Church. So there's a much stronger separation in the French context between church and state. But the French Revolution, where the concept of French laïcité, and the Turkish term for this is laïcité, is a very anti-clerical element in it. What do I mean by anti-clerical? In other words, it's one way of looking at religion as a regressive force in society, as a force that is basically obscurantist, as a force that is regressive, as a force that is against the revolution, the counter-revolutionary force. In that sense, the Catholic Church and Catholicism has been associated in the French context with the Ancien Régime. And similar in Turkey, we have the revolution, cultural revolution that Turkey experienced with the founding father, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and in very many ways, Kemalism and Young Turks, before Kemalism, also developed a certain affinity for anti-clerical secularism, anti-clerical laïcité. They also associated Islam with the Ancien Régime of Turkey, which was basically the Ottoman paradigm. Ottomans, in this kind of view, were basically obscurantists because they decided, they took political decisions based on Islam. The Ottoman Empire was a theocracy, And that kind of view, the Kemalist view of Ottomanism, Ottomans as a theocracy, associated the ancien regime of Turkey with religion. So there are interesting parallels between France and Turkey, the way they look at this question of secularism. The British way, however, evolves not from the Catholic context, but evolves from essentially a break between the Catholic Church and basically the Protestant faith, a kind of sectarian divide. And as a general rule, we can say that when you have in Europe a Protestant country at hand, it's much easier to have an organic relationship between church and state, because most of the time the Protestant church in Europe evolved as a result of a break with the Catholic Church, and they needed state protection. The religious wars of Europe were essentially between Protestants and Catholics, and it was crucial for the Protestant faith to have state protection. Without state protection, the Protestant faith, the Calvinism, Lutheranism, would not have survived. Therefore, this is why in Germany, in Britain, you have situations where there's not a real, in the French sense, clear separation of church and state, but more organic relations between church and state. So that issue is very relevant for the very issue we're talking about, the headscarf issue. Why? Because the way you treat religious symbols is very much dependent on your kind of what kind of secularism you're practicing. In the case of France, the whole Third Republic of France, which is chronologically from 1870s to 1940s, was essentially based on a cultural war between the Catholic Church and the Republic. And the schools were the main arena where that culture war between the Republic and the Catholic Church took place. One of the major problems was whether there would be crosses in the school of the Republic, or whether there would be other religious symbols. In many ways, there was a sense that these religious symbols were challenges to the French Revolution, and that basically this was a sign that a counter-revolution was in the making. Whereas in the case of Britain, you did not have such a polarization. In Germany, you did not have it either. To this day, Britain and Germany, two countries that are home to significant Muslim populations, have a much more relaxed attitude towards the headscarf. For instance, in Britain, it's not a coincidence that they have a more relaxed attitude towards secularism, and therefore they have a more relaxed attitude towards the headscarf. Pakistani girls, Bengali girls in Britain can go to school with their headscarf. Teachers can become teachers with the headscarf. You can become a civil servant wearing a headscarf. In fact, one of the posters of British tourism is this Pakistani lady conducting traffic in Trafalgar Square, and she's wearing a headscarf, and she's a traffic police. She's a civil servant of the British government in many ways, and yet she's wearing the headscarf. That's the sign of basically symbol of British multiculturalism. In that sense, what I'm arguing is that this kind of approach to secularism brings a more relaxed approach towards